The chandeliers of Mayfair glittered like a constellation trapped beneath glass, scattering brilliance across silk and satin. Yet beneath that celestial splendor lingered a cruelty as sharp as winter frost. The orchestra tuned its violins with nervous flourishes while ladies fanned themselves in perfumed clusters, their laughter lilting and deliberate, as though gaiety could be practiced into perfection. It was a night devised for spectacle, for alliances, for the delicate choreography of reputation. And yet, before the first waltz had fully gathered breath, the evening had already chosen its victim. "The blind Duke attends," someone murmured, and the whisper slithered outward with serpentine ease. A rustle followed, gloves adjusted, daughters repositioned, ambitious mothers calculating risk. The title was ancient and unimpeachable, the man who bore it was not. Where once he had ridden at the head of regiments and hunted across ancestral acres, he now moved within darkness, sight stolen in a single merciless instant 3 years prior. London had applauded his stoicism then. Tonight it shrank from his presence. When the footman announced him, "His Grace the Duke of Harrowby," conversation faltered. He entered not with the swagger of entitlement but with the measured precision of one who must map the world by memory and echo. His cane touched marble in soft, decisive strokes. His shoulders were square beneath tailored black, his expression composed, almost austere. A faint scar traced his temple, pale against olive skin, disappearing into dark hair brushed immaculately back. His eyes, once renowned for their keen intelligence, now held a stillness that unsettled those who met them. They reflected light but did not answer it. He paused at the threshold as though listening to the room breathe. Silence answered him, thick and telling. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging an audience he could not see yet felt with acute awareness. The air trembled with restrained sympathy and poorly disguised discomfort. Somewhere behind a fan a girl whispered, "How tragic," and her mother replied, "How unfortunate for a husband." The Duke advanced, guided by the butler's discreet murmur, though he required little assistance. He knew ballrooms, he knew their dimensions, their customary arrangements. What he did not know was which heart might brave the distance between admiration and action. The orchestra struck the first notes of a waltz, strings lifting into brightness. Partners formed with eager haste. Silk brushed silk, polished shoes found their mirror. Laughter returned, relieved and cruelly buoyant. He remained unclaimed. His gloved hand rested lightly upon the silver head of his cane. If disappointment pricked him, it did not fracture his composure. Yet his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his breathing grew precise, as though dignity were a discipline he practiced with each inhale. He had once been the most sought-after gentleman in England, lauded for intellect, wit, and a gaze that made debutantes blush. Now, silence courted him more faithfully than any lady. "It is remarkable," he said softly to no one in particular, his voice smooth and resonant above the swell of violins, "how loudly pity breathes in a silent room." The words were neither bitter nor pleading. They were observational, edged with restrained steel. A nearby cluster of gentlemen stiffened, uncertain whether to admire or retreat. Across the ballroom stood a young woman nearly absorbed into the wallpaper of propriety. Her gown was of dove-gray muslin, elegant but modest, chosen more for practicality than spectacle. No diamonds adorned her throat, no fortune shadowed her name. She served as companion to a distant aunt and possessed neither dowry nor dazzling prospects. Yet her gaze, clear, steady, unhurried, rested not upon the chandeliers or the rivalries unfolding, but upon the solitary figure beneath them. Miss Eleanor Whitcombe had grown accustomed to invisibility. In drawing rooms she listened more than she spoke. In gardens she observed the subtle dialogues of wind and petal. Where others saw only tragedy in the Duke's blindness, she perceived something rarer, a man besieged not by darkness but by expectation. She noticed the restraint in his posture, the precise angle of his head as he tracked conversations by sound, the faint tremor of isolation he refused to betray. The waltz swelled toward its second refrain. Still no lady approached him. A flicker of resolve crossed Eleanor's features. It was not recklessness that moved her, nor naive compassion. It was recognition, the quiet kinship of two souls habitually overlooked. Around her whispers coiled like smoke. "He cannot even lead," someone muttered. "One would be forever guiding him." Eleanor stepped forward. Her slippers scarcely whispered against the floor, yet the movement drew notice. A few brows arched, one matron gasped softly. She crossed the expanse between safety and scrutiny with measured grace, every heartbeat echoing in her ears. When she reached him, she curtsied deeply, the folds of her gown pooling like subdued moonlight at her feet. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "if you would honor me, I should be grateful for this dance." The orchestra faltered, not in sound but in spirit. Conversations fractured mid-syllable. The Duke turned his face toward her, attentive to the cadence of her breath. For a fraction of a second, something unguarded flickered across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or caution. "You must know," he replied quietly so that only she could hear, "what you risk." His hand lifted slightly from his cane, suspended between retreat and acceptance. Eleanor did not glance behind her at the ring of watching eyes, nor did she permit the heat of scrutiny to drive color from her cheeks. Instead, she extended her gloved hand toward him, steady as a promise. "I risk nothing," she answered, though her pulse raced. "For I believe you quite capable of leading, Your Grace." A hush deepened, thick as velvet. The Duke's fingers hovered inches from hers, poised at the brink of contact, while all of London seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether dignity would once more be denied, or whether, for the first time that evening, darkness might find its answer in a single, unflinching touch. For one suspended heartbeat, the ballroom existed only in the narrow space between their hands. Then the Duke's gloved fingers settled into Eleanor's palm, firm and deliberate, and the air shifted as though the chandeliers themselves had drawn breath. A murmur rippled outward, astonishment first, then speculation sharpened by envy. Yet he did not withdraw. Instead, he inclined his head with grave precision and said, "You grant me a kindness I did not solicit, Miss?" "Whitcombe," she supplied gently. "Miss Whitcombe," he repeated as though committing the cadence to memory. "Pray forgive me if I tread upon your courage." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then I shall forgive you only if you tread with confidence." It was a dangerous reply, and he recognized it as such. The orchestra, uncertain whether to falter or flourish, resumed the waltz in earnest. Eleanor stepped closer, guiding his hand to her waist with a subtlety that did not proclaim instruction. His other hand enclosed hers, warm through kid leather, and for the first time that evening his posture altered, not with pride but with intention. He was no longer an exhibit beneath crystal light. He was a partner. They began. At first, their movements were cautious, a negotiation of rhythm and space. Eleanor counted beneath her breath, barely audible, shaping the tempo so that he might feel it rather than hear it. He listened, not merely to the orchestra but to her pulse, her inhale, the faint whisper of silk against polished floor. Within moments, his steps aligned with hers in quiet synchronization. Gasps fluttered at the edges of the room. "You do not tremble," he observed softly. "Because I do not fear you, Your Grace." The words settled between them like a vow neither had anticipated. His jaw tightened, not in restraint but in astonishment. For years he had been handled as though made of fragile glass or heavy sorrow. She offered neither indulgence nor reverence. She offered equilibrium. They turned, the sweep of her gray skirts catching candlelight. He led, not flawlessly but decisively, responding to the architecture of the room through echo and instinct. When a pair drifted too near, he adjusted with subtle grace, guided by the change in air and the minute shift of Eleanor's frame. Confidence, long dormant, began to kindle beneath his composure. Around them, conversation resumed in a lower key. "She seeks advancement," a baritone muttered. "Or notoriety," a woman replied, her fan snapping closed like judgment itself. Mothers observed with narrowed calculation. Suitors recalibrated their interest in a companion who had suddenly stepped into dangerous visibility. Eleanor heard the whispers. She refused to bend beneath them. Instead, she lifted her chin a fraction higher and met the Duke's unseeing gaze with steady warmth. For a fleeting instant, she felt less invisible than she had in all her years of polite obscurity. The waltz swelled toward its crescendo. As they completed the final turn, his hand at her waist lingered a fraction longer than propriety required. Applause, tentative then swelling, broke the tension. It was not unanimous admiration, but it was acknowledgement. The Duke inclined his head once more. "You have altered the climate of this room, Miss Whitcombe," he murmured. "I wonder whether you comprehend the storm such alteration invites." "I have lived through harsher weather than whispers," she replied, though her pulse betrayed the cost of bravery. He released her with visible reluctance. The distance between them felt abrupt, almost disorienting. A footman appeared at his side, offering discreet guidance, yet the Duke raised a hand to decline immediate retreat. Instead, he addressed the gathering in a voice that carried effortlessly across silk and suspicion. "My thanks to Miss Whitcombe," he declared, for reminding me that music remains music regardless of whether one sees the orchestra." The statement was simple, yet it struck with quiet defiance. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others regarded Eleanor with new appraisal. To publicly single her out was to tether her reputation to his. It was also to shield her, however subtly, beneath the dignity of gratitude. Later that evening, as carriages rattled along lamplit streets, speculation traveled faster than wheels. By morning, drawing rooms from Mayfair to Kensington hummed with embroidered accounts of the dance. In some versions she had guided him like a nurse, in others she had ensnared him like a strategist. Truth, as always, proved less entertaining than conjecture. Eleanor returned to her modest lodgings with cheeks still warm from scrutiny. She told herself it had been one dance, nothing more. Yet the memory of his steady hand and measured voice unsettled her composure. She had not acted from ambition. She had acted from recognition. Whether London would ever believe such a motive was doubtful. 2 days later a parcel arrived. It was modest in size yet carefully wrapped, bearing the Duke's crest impressed in dark wax. Eleanor's fingers hesitated upon the seal. Within lay a cluster of white gardenias, fresh and fragrant, their petals luminous against simple paper. No elaborate note accompanied them, only a card inscribed in firm, restrained script. "You granted me dignity when others granted silence." The words trembled in her grasp. They were neither flirtation nor obligation. They were acknowledgment, profound and perilous. To accept such a token was to step further into the sphere of scrutiny she had already stirred. That afternoon an invitation followed, requesting her presence at a forthcoming musicale hosted at the Duke's townhouse. It was not phrased as a command but as a courtesy. Still, society would not interpret it kindly. Attendance would confirm what gossip already sculpted into scandal. Eleanor stood by her narrow window as twilight pooled along the rooftops. Gardenias perfumed the room, sweet and insistent. She understood now that the dance had not concluded upon the ballroom floor. It had begun something far less predictable. Across the city, the Duke sat alone in his study, fingertips brushing the arm of the chair where her presence seemed to linger in memory. He had meant only to thank her. Instead, he had invited consequence. And somewhere between gratitude and defiance, both had taken a step from which retreat would no longer be simple. Rain fell with the delicate persistence of a whispered secret, silvering the Duke's garden and driving the last of the musicale's guests beneath awnings and into waiting carriages. Laughter, bright and brittle, dissolved into the damp evening air, leaving behind the perfume of crushed grass and roses bowed beneath water's weight. Within the townhouse, applause still echoed faintly from the final sonata, yet in the shadowed terrace beyond the French doors, a different music gathered, quieter, more perilous. Eleanor had not intended to step outside. The invitation itself had been audacious enough, her presence at his musicale a subject of thinly veiled scrutiny. Throughout the evening she had felt the weight of glances measuring her gown, her posture, her proximity to the Duke. He had acknowledged her publicly with impeccable courtesy, seating her within clear view of the assembly and requesting her opinion on each performance as though it were indispensable. Such gestures were neither accidental nor mild. They were protection. They were declaration. And they were dangerous. Now, seeking a moment's air away from velvet curtains and speculation, she slipped onto the terrace. Rain kissed her cheeks, cool and clarifying. Lanterns along the garden path burned low, their halos trembling in the drizzle. She did not expect to find him there. He stood near the stone balustrade, one hand resting lightly upon its edge, face lifted as though listening to the sky. Without the architecture of guests and etiquette around him, he seemed at once taller and more solitary. The rain darkened his hair, traced the line of his brow, slid unheeded across the scar at his temple. He did not turn at her approach. "I wondered," he said quietly, "whether you would brave the weather or the whispers." She halted, startled less by his presence than by the accuracy of his perception. "Perhaps I required relief from both." A faint curve touched his mouth. "Then we are similarly inclined." For a moment they stood in shared silence, rain stitching the distance between them. From within a door closed, carriage wheels rolled away. The world contracted to damp stone and breathing space. "You should not have invited me so conspicuously," she said at last, the words steady though her pulse was not. "Your Grace knows what London will make of it." "I know precisely what London will make of it," he replied. "That is why I did." She studied him, uncertain whether to admire his defiance or fear its consequences. "And what do you make of it?" He exhaled slowly. "I make of it a debt I cannot repay." The confession was not what she expected. She stepped closer, rain gathering at the hem of her gown. "I did not dance with you to incur obligation." "No," he said, turning slightly toward her voice. "You danced with me because you did not see a spectacle. You saw a man." His fingers tightened upon the stone. "Do you know what it is, Miss Whitcombe, to be measured solely by what you lack?" She felt the question rather than heard it. "Yes." The word slipped from her before caution intervened. He stilled. "I have lived most of my life as an accessory," she continued, the rain lending courage to honesty. "Present yet peripheral. Useful yet unnoticed. When one is unseen, one learns to observe keenly. One learns the language of silence." A quiet passed between them, dense with recognition. The Duke's composure, so meticulously maintained within ballrooms, seemed to loosen beneath the rain's impartial witness. "When the accident occurred," he said slowly, "I believed the darkness the worst of it. I was mistaken. The true calamity was the alteration in how others approached me, voices softened to pity, footsteps hesitant, conversations edited lest I feel excluded. They believed they spared me cruelty. Instead, they exiled me from candor." "And you would prefer cruelty?" she asked gently. "I would prefer truth." His jaw flexed. "If a man despises me, let him despise me openly. If a lady fears a blind husband, let her refuse me without rehearsal. But do not swaddle me in reverence as though I were already a relic." The rain intensified, pattering against leaves like applause from an unseen audience. Eleanor stepped nearer still until only inches separated them. "Then allow me truth," she said softly. "I did not approach you from charity. I approached you because your solitude angered me." His brows drew together. "Angered you?" "Yes. Not because you were alone, but because no one else possessed the courage to remedy it." The admission hung between them, fragile and incendiary. He reached toward her, hesitant, as though navigating an unfamiliar room. His fingers brushed her sleeve, then her wrist. She did not retreat. Instead, she guided his hand upward until his gloved knuckles rested lightly against her cheek. He inhaled sharply, as though struck by lightning disguised as warmth. Slowly, reverently, he traced the curve of her jaw, the line of her brow, memorizing contours through touch. It was an intimacy more profound than any dance. "You are very real," he murmured. "As are you." His hand lingered, thumb grazing the corner of her mouth. The world narrowed to breath and rain and the faint tremor in his restraint. "If I were selfish," he said, voice lowered to a near whisper, "I would kiss you now." Her heart stuttered. "And are you not entitled to selfishness, your grace?" He withdrew abruptly, composure snapping back into place like armor. "I cannot afford it." Footsteps sounded within the house, servants preparing to extinguish lamps, guests departing. Reality pressed inward. "You think yourself my burden," she said quietly. "I think myself your liability," he corrected. The distinction pierced her. Before she could answer, a sharp peal of laughter drifted from the doorway, accompanied by a woman's voice edged in triumph. "I thought I might find you here, your grace." Eleanor turned. Framed in golden lamplight stood Lady Margaret Ashbourne, wealthy, admired, and entirely unimpressed by scandal. Her gaze flicked from Eleanor's rain-dampened form to the Duke's proximity with calculating clarity. "London is already speaking," Lady Margaret continued smoothly. "I should hate for it to conclude that gratitude has evolved." The rain seemed suddenly colder. The Duke's posture straightened, steel returning to his spine. "And what would you have London conclude, Lady Margaret?" he asked evenly. She smiled, slow and knowing. "That you are wise enough to choose advantage over impulse." Eleanor felt the weight of the challenge settle like a gauntlet at her feet. Between duty and desire, between protection and passion, the next step would define more than reputation. The Duke did not reach for her again. Instead, he said with measured calm, "Miss Whitcombe requires no defense." Yet he did not dismiss Lady Margaret. And in that fragile hesitation, beneath the relentless rain, Eleanor understood that courage alone would not shield them from what followed. By the following afternoon, London had transformed hesitation into spectacle. Drawing rooms murmured with embellished certainty, and invitations shifted tone from cordial to cautious. Eleanor felt the alteration keenly when her aunt received a politely worded note suggesting that circumstances rendered her companionship temporarily unnecessary at an upcoming luncheon. The word carried the weight of exile. Eleanor accepted the dismissal without protest, yet the sting was undeniable. Society had decided she was either reckless or calculating, and neither verdict allowed for innocence. The Duke, meanwhile, endured a subtler siege. Gentlemen who had once sought his counsel now approached him with careful detachment, as though affection for a modest companion signaled diminished judgment. Lady Margaret's presence grew more deliberate. She called upon him that morning under the guise of concern, her voice smooth as polished marble. She spoke of alliances, of estates strengthened by prudent marriages, of the necessity of perception in a world governed by appearances. She did not insult Eleanor directly. She did not need to. Her meaning threaded through every elegant syllable. Your Grace must consider how swiftly admiration curdles into ridicule, she warned lightly. A title such as yours cannot be governed by sentiment. The Duke listened without interruption, fingers resting against the carved arm of his chair. You mistake me, Lady Margaret, he replied evenly. I have never governed myself by sentiment. She smiled, satisfied, believing she had restored him to pragmatism. When she departed, the study felt colder. That evening he requested Eleanor's presence at a ball he had not originally intended to attend. The invitation was brief, formal, unmistakable. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. If scandal had chosen her as its subject, she would not hide from its gaze. The ballroom that night shimmered with more than candlelight, it vibrated with anticipation. Conversations faltered when Eleanor entered alone, clad once more in restrained elegance. No jewels adorned her throat, yet dignity itself seemed to frame her. Whispers followed her progress like an unseen train. When the Duke was announced, the room stilled with practiced civility. He entered with measured confidence, refusing assistance beyond what was strictly necessary. The orchestra waited. So did London. Lady Margaret stood near the dais, luminous in crimson silk, her composure immaculate. Several influential matrons clustered at her side, prepared to witness the restoration of propriety. It was widely assumed the Duke would seek a partner whose wealth and influence secured his standing beyond reproach. Instead, he crossed the floor toward Eleanor. The movement was unhurried yet unmistakable. The hush that followed was not merely curious, it was electric. Eleanor felt her pulse climb but held her ground as he stopped before her. Miss Whitcombe, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the expectant air, might I request your company? The simplicity of the question belied its magnitude. She placed her hand in his without flourish. You may. They began to dance, and this time there was no tentative adjustment, no uncertain negotiation. He led with assurance born of trust rather than pride. She followed with equal certainty, no longer guiding but responding. Their steps traced arcs of quiet defiance across polished floorboards. A murmur swelled at the edges of the room. A gentleman near the dais spoke too loudly in his disdain. A duke reduced to courting obscurity, he scoffed. How tragic. The words carried. The Duke heard them. The dance did not falter, yet something in his bearing sharpened. As the final note faded, he released Eleanor and turned toward the voice. I may not see the gentleman who addressed my circumstances, he said calmly, but I assure him I recognize cowardice when it speaks from behind another's shoulder. A collective intake of breath swept the ballroom. The offending gentleman flushed, retreating beneath the weight of collective scrutiny. Lady Margaret's smile thinned. The Duke did not allow silence to dissipate into gossip. Instead, he extended his hand once more, not to Eleanor for another turn, but upward, requesting attention from the entire assembly. For 3 years, he began, I have been the beneficiary of society's delicate considerations. I have been spared blunt truths and offered curated sympathies. I have endured it because I believed it the cost of dignity. His head lifted slightly as though aligning himself with unseen constellations. But dignity does not reside in avoidance. It resides in courage. His hand found Eleanor's again, fingers firm around hers. This lady granted me honesty when others granted distance. She approached me not as a relic of misfortune but as a man capable of partnership. If that offends the delicate architecture of expectation, then perhaps the architecture requires renovation. The declaration rang through crystal and candlelight alike. Lady Margaret stepped forward, her composure fracturing at last. Your Grace must consider? I have considered, he interrupted, not harshly but decisively, and I find my judgment unclouded. He turned slightly toward Eleanor, his voice lowering yet still audible to those nearest. I do not require a wife to complete an estate. I require a companion who does not mistake darkness for deficiency. Her breath caught, though her posture remained unwavering. The room felt suspended between tradition and transformation. Miss Whitcombe, he continued, every syllable deliberate, if you will accept a future that promises scrutiny alongside devotion, I would ask not merely for another dance, but for your hand in marriage." The words landed with the force of thunder beneath chandeliers. Gasps fractured the silence. Fans fluttered like startled birds. No one mistook the gravity of the moment. This was not impulse. It was defiance crystallized into vow. Eleanor felt the weight of 100 judgments pressing against her spine. To accept would bind her irrevocably to both privilege and controversy. To refuse would preserve safety at the cost of something rarer. She looked at him, at the steadiness of his jaw, the vulnerability he did not disguise, the hand extended not in command but in trust. The ballroom waited. And in that charged stillness, with London poised to either recoil or revere, Eleanor opened her lips to answer, knowing that whatever word emerged would alter not only her destiny but his. Silence gathered like a held breath beneath the chandeliers, pressing against Eleanor's ribs until she feared her answer might fracture it. Every gaze in the ballroom fixed upon her, curious, condemning, calculating. Yet the only presence she felt with piercing clarity was the man before her, his hand extended not as a duke accustomed to obedience, but as a man who had wagered pride upon hope. She did not lower her eyes. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady though her heart thundered, "I have never feared the dark." A murmur surged and broke like a wave against marble walls. But she did not falter. "If I accept your hand," she continued, "it will not be from gratitude nor rebellion. It will be because I believe your strength is not diminished by blindness, nor mine by obscurity. I will stand beside you, not behind you nor beneath you." The Duke's fingers tightened imperceptibly around hers, as though anchoring himself to the certainty in her tone. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a composure that masked the tremor of emotion beneath it, he inclined his head. "Then stand beside me always," he replied quietly, yet the resonance of his voice carried to the furthest corners of the room. Applause did not erupt at once. Shock lingered too heavily for immediate celebration. Lady Margaret's expression hardened into brittle civility. Several matrons exchanged glances weighted with disapproval. Yet somewhere among the assembly a gentleman began to clap, tentative at first, then firmer. Others followed, whether from admiration or the instinct to align with power, none could say. The sound gathered until it filled the chamber, not unanimous, but undeniable. The Duke lifted Eleanor's hand and pressed it to his lips. It was not a theatrical gesture, it was reverent. In that simple act he transformed scandal into declaration. The days that followed were not gentle. Invitations diminished. Editorial columns speculated with veiled cruelty. Some acquaintances retreated altogether, unwilling to attach themselves to what they deemed an imprudent match. Yet the Duke did not withdraw into injured pride. Instead, he moved through London with renewed certainty, Eleanor at his side. He insisted upon walking with her publicly through Hyde Park, refusing both carriage and concealment. He attended soirees she might otherwise have been excluded from and ensured she was introduced not as a curiosity, but as his fiancée. When whispers reached his ears, and they always did, he met them not with anger but with calm acknowledgement. "Let them speak," he told her one evening as they strolled along a gravel path silvered by moonlight. "Words lose their power when we refuse to surrender to them." "And if they never cease?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Then we shall give them something worth speaking of." The wedding was not the grand spectacle society had anticipated. Some prominent figures declined attendance under pretext of illness or travel. Yet the chapel glowed with quiet sincerity. Those who came did so because affection outweighed ambition. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting color across stone and skin alike. When Eleanor approached the altar, her steps were unhurried. She wore ivory silk unadorned by ostentation, her veil simple and luminous. The Duke stood waiting, posture erect, expression composed but unguarded. He did not require guidance to know she had entered. He felt the shift in air, heard the cadence of her breath. As vows were spoken, his voice did not waver. "I pledge you partnership," he said, each syllable deliberate. "Not protection born of pride, but trust born of equality. I cannot promise you a life untouched by scrutiny, but I can promise you a life never governed by fear." When her turn came, Eleanor's gaze did not drift toward the congregation. It remained fixed upon him. "I pledge you candor," she replied softly, "and the courage to remind you when doubt approaches, that darkness is not absence, but depth." The final benediction felt less like conclusion than commencement. Their first dance as husband and wife took place not in a ballroom thick with speculation, but in the garden of his estate, beneath open sky. Twilight brushed the horizon in shades of rose and indigo. No orchestra accompanied them, Only the whisper of wind through leaves and the faint trill of evening birds bore witness. "You may guide me if you wish," she teased gently. He shook his head, a hint of playful resolve in his expression. "No, my lady. Tonight I lead." And he did. His steps were measured yet confident, attuned to the rhythm he had memorized through countless small interactions, the cadence of her laughter, the timing of her breath, the subtle shift of her weight. He no longer relied upon careful accommodation. He relied upon knowledge. Knowledge of her. They turned slowly across grass still warm from daylight. Eleanor felt the profound shift within him, not a miracle of restored sight, but of restored self-assurance. He did not move as a man compensating for loss. He moved as a man defined by choice. When the dance ended, he drew her close, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "You once altered the climate of a room," he murmured. "Now you have altered the course of my life." She smiled, tears bright but unfallen. "You altered it yourself when you chose courage over caution." Months later, society's outrage dulled into reluctant fascination. Some who had shunned them quietly sought invitation to their gatherings. Others remained distant, clinging to their prejudices as though they were heirlooms. The Duke did not pursue reconciliation nor revenge. He cultivated instead a household defined by authenticity. Scholars, artists, and thinkers found welcome at his table, drawn less by title than by atmosphere. One evening, as Eleanor walked with him through the rose garden he had planted in her honor, she paused. The blooms were white, gardenias and roses interwoven, perfuming the twilight with gentle sweetness. "You never asked whether I regretted it," she said softly. He turned his face toward her, voice, expression thoughtful. "Do you?" She placed his hand against her heart. "Not for a single breath." He exhaled, tension dissolving in the simplicity of her assurance. "Then let London call it folly," he replied. "I shall call it fortune." The world beyond their gates continued its relentless chatter, but within those walls, dignity flourished unchallenged. The Duke had not regained his sight. The impossible had not manifested in spectacle. Yet something far rarer had occurred. He had been seen. And because one humble young lady had dared to cross a silent ballroom and take his hand, darkness itself had been transformed, not into light, but into a realm where love required no vision to endure.